To flight, I am forgotten like the unremembered dead, like a dish that now is broken. Father, I put my life in your hands. I place my trust in you, Lord. In your hands is my destiny. Let your face shine upon your servant, Lord. In your hands I will place my life. Father, I put my life in your hands.
After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees. And they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, "For whom are you looking?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "For whom are you looking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you were looking for me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. First they took him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was better to have one person die for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus, since that disciple was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter was standing outside at the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. The woman said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing round it and warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. Then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered, "I have spoken openly to the word. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest.
Now Simon Peter was standing, warming himself. They asked him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you, in the garden with him?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, the cock crowed. Then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews replied, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priest have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no case against him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" They shouted in reply, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a bandit.
Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged, and the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and striking him on the face. Pilate went out again and said to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to the law, he ought to die, because he has claimed to be the Son of God." Now when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you and power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the Jews, "Here is your king." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, with two others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Then the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews." But this man said, "I am the King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took off his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it." This was to fulfill what the scriptures said. "They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." And that is what the soldiers did. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciples whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her into his home. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there. So they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. And when Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit.
Bishop Will Willimon tells a story of traveling in the south of England when his car broke down. While it was being worked on by the village mechanic, he decided to take a stroll through the village. He came to a church, and the church contained a cemetery next to it. And so he began walking through the cemetery when he noticed this area in the cemetery that seemed to be cordoned off from the rest of it. There was a short brick wall around it. It was well kept, and on the wall were these words, "We shall never forget your sacrifice." And so he looked at the graves. There were 50 graves, and each individual was between the age of 17 and 25. He had no idea who they were, and so he went into the church and he asked about it. He said, "Those 50 graves out there in that little area of the cemetery," he said, "who are they? There are no names on the graves. Only, we shall never forget your sacrifice." And the preacher said, "I don't know whose graves those are." So he went to the small museum in the town, and he asked the curator. There's a cemetery next to the church, as you know, and there's a part of the cemetery that is kind of blocked off from the rest. Small brick wall around it, and on the wall are the words, "We shall never forget your sacrifice. Do you know anything about the story?" And the curator of the museum said, "No, I don't know anything about that, but I can look it up and tell you in a couple of days." And Willimon said he went back to the cemetery and he looked at those graves and he said, "Those people lied to those young men because no one remembered. No one remembered the sacrifice that these young men from 17 to 25 had made somehow, in some way, in the past." Recently, some staff and I completed the book, The Path to Character. Each chapter in the book focuses on a particular individual, and one of the chapters devoted attention to a woman by the name of Dorothy Day, who started the Catholic Workers Movement. The chapter begins with David Brooks telling the story of her life as a young child. She lived in Oakland with her family, and they experienced the San Francisco earthquake, and even though it did not devastate Oakland, it affected Oakland. And she said the earthquake came and she was in her bed that night and the house began to shake. And she said her parents grabbed up all of the children and ran out into the front yard because they feared that the house was going to collapse. They grabbed up all of the children except Dorothy Day, who was left in her bedroom by herself during the earthquake. They forgot about her. And so as the pictures were falling off of the wall and as the dresser was tumbling over, this 8-year-old child lay in the bed terrified because her parents had forgotten her. They didn't remember her. They remembered the other 3, but they did not remember Dorothy. John devotes himself to the alignment of the crosses. Jesus in the middle and one thief on the right and another thief on the left. Luke puts words in their mouths. And you will recall that one of those thieves looked at Jesus and joined in the mockery and joined in the cruelty of it all. The other thief looked to Jesus and said to him, "Remember me. Remember me." We all want to be remembered, don't we? We don't want to think that we're a child of 2 parents and they remember every child but us. I can remember, perhaps because I was the youngest in the family, I always had a thing about being left out. My brother and sister were 5 years older and 4 years older than me, and so they were arriving at certain rites of passage before I did, and as a result, I was watching them do things that I couldn't do, and that made me feel left out. It made me feel at times like, hey, you know, that's why the little one's always calling out for attention, because they think they're being left out. My parents were not excellent spoilers, but they spoiled me, I'm sure, as the baby in the family. But I remember having those feelings from time to time, and we all have them. We all want to be remembered. We all want to be in the mind and the heart of people we love and people who love us. Remember me. Why? You've wasted your life. You're hanging here being executed because you've done something terrible. Why should you be remembered? Here you've come to the end of your life and desperately you cry out to me, remember me. Why? Why do you think you should be remembered? We might have answered the question that way, but Jesus did not. Jesus turned to him and said to him, today you shall be with me in paradise. You are remembered. In this moment of cruelty and execution, when the world is looking upon you as the criminal that you are, in my eyes, you are my child. And today, you shall be with me in paradise. It's strange, isn't it? We don't live in that kind of world. Heaven goes by favor, Mark Twain said. Heaven goes by favor. If it went by merit, we would be left out and our dogs would go in. Because dogs, for the most part, are better than we are, but they have their issues as well. But heaven is not about merit. Heaven is not about keeping score, but we live in a world that keeps score every single day of our lives. How much did you do well today, and how much did you do poorly? When did you succeed, and when did you fail? And people remember that from time to time, especially those moments when we fail them. And sometimes we don't find forgiveness. When I was a child, I would ride on the rural route with my dad, and every house we passed on that route had chickens in the yard. And chickens dance the kind of dance of domination. They establish a pecking order early on, and they compete and they fight for seed. It's a chicken peck chicken world that we live in. And into that environment, into that world, we try to live out the gospel. And into this super competitive, score-keeping world, grace breaks in. That's what today is all about. Remember me. Today you shall be with me in paradise. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. That's the message of our faith. That love endures is an architectural term which means covers. It means you put a roof on a house. Love covers a multitude of sins. This death was a sacrificial death. This death is the atoning work of a holy God who paid the price for us. When I was sick, I would talk from time to time with my mentor and my dear friend. And in one of our conversations, when I was recalling the difficulty of things, because we've known each other so long, he could say this to me and I could hear it. And what he said to me was this. He said, Chuck, don't waste your suffering. Don't waste your suffering. And I would say to you today, as we gather in this place with one candle burning, lights dimmed, looking at a cross draped in black with a crown of thorns at the top, I would say to you, don't waste his suffering. Don't waste his suffering. This wasn't for nothing. This was for you. Don't waste it. The Lord's Prayer is 56 words. The 23rd Psalm is 118 words. The Department of Agriculture's directive on pricing cabbage is 15,629 words. Sometimes it takes just a little to say a lot. Remember me. Today, you shall be with me in paradise.
He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that made us whole, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all.